Hi, my name is Todd Leonard,
And my name is Herb Montgomery.
and we're just talking.
Before we begin this week, please take a moment and hit that like and subscribe button there on your screen.
And if you want to be notified when the new episode drops each week, then click on that bell icon.
Each week, we will be talking about the gospel lectionary reading for the upcoming weekend.
And we're hoping to always be doing that in the context of love, inclusion, and societal justice. And our hope is that our talking will be actually just talking. So this week's reading comes to us in Matthew 17, and it's the familiar story that we hit every time this time of year comes around, right before Lent, which is the story of Jesus' Transfiguration. And this year, in year A of the lectionary, has it happening from Matthew's account, and we're in Matthew 17, verses 1 through 9. So, Herb, we're dealing with a very familiar story and looking at it from what Matthew wants to emphasize about it. So, where do we start?
Well, the first thing that I always like to talk about with the Transfiguration, especially in today's climate, is that their Christian history is littered with a tradition of interpreting this story in a very supersessionist way or supersessionism. And what that means is that it's the teaching that somehow the Christian church has replaced the Jewish people as God's chosen, and it's a replacement theology, is what it is. And traditionally, the way this passage is interpreted is you have Moses and Elijah that show up and they represent the law and the prophets. And then you have Jesus and this divine endorsement. And now, as you followed Moses and Elijah, now I want you to turn from them and follow Jesus as this new lawgiver instead. And it's a Jesus instead of Moses and Elijah. And I just want to start off this week by saying that I could not disagree with this interpretation of this story more. I think that teaching, holding up Jesus in contrast to Moses and Elijah has been historically deeply harmful by Christians to the Jewish community. And I want to be very clear as we begin this week. We need interpretations that are life-giving for everyone, and supersessionism and any type of interpretation that leans that way is not life-giving.
And I think if you're careful with the text and reading the Gospels, you're not seeing Jesus as somebody who's wanting to supersede anybody anyway. I think what you see is him trying to align himself with his understanding of the best of the Mosaic tradition and the best of the prophets, and align himself in that context rather than saying I'm now the antitype of the type that everybody was pointing to me, but actually he is just simply trying to be a reformer and a person who continues in the tradition that these men did before him. I think that's an excellent point and important to state.
Yeah, I think that Jesus, um, rather than, well, first of all, Jesus was a Jewish man in the first century, raised on the Torah. You know what I mean? So we've got to stay within those boundaries. And Jesus, again, wasn't starting a new religion. I interpret the Jesus of the Jesus story as more of a Jewish renewal movement. You know, he was bringing people back to his definition of what fidelity to the Torah looked like, and it looked like inclusion, it looked like love, it looked like compassion, and his voice was not the only voice saying those things back then, and his voice too was a Jewish voice among many other Jewish voices in conversation about what fidelity, not replacement of the Torah, but what fidelity to the Torah would look like in their current context, their current situation at that time. So I mean, again, Jesus was a Jewish man,
Right.
and we need to not forget that.
And I think Matthew again is one of the, as many of us know, is considered writing specifically with the Jewish audience in mind when he is writing to, and so this would be something where he would be trying to make an honoring the Jewish tradition, not trying to undermine it in any way, shape, or form, because he's trying to reach. And again, not the debate on when Matthew was written. Christianity in that time was not a separate tradition yet. It was probably somewhere in the process, only because of the debates that were taking place in Judaism among those who were accepting Christ and those who were not accepting Christ. And the debate was, but it was an intra-Judaism thing going on, and Matthew is probably trying to contribute to that discussion in some way, shape, or form in writing his version of the gospel. And so I would
Yeah, I think
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think most scholars agree that Matthew is written to Jewish Jesus followers in Galilee. It's not like the Luke and Gentile flavor. It's more of the Jewish emphasis and the Jewishness, especially in the Galilean region. And you were just talking to, I mean, Matthew 5, just a few chapters earlier, Matthew's version of Jesus has Jesus saying in the Sermon on the Mount, "Think not that I've come to destroy the law and the prophets." You know what I'm saying? So there's an integration here. Jesus is in harmony with the Torah, not opposed or replacing or superseding.
Yeah, I think that's so well said. And I think when you read from the Torah, you read from the Hebrew scriptures, you see there's so much alignment in the prophetic voice of the Jewish scriptures, and in the work that Moses did and Elijah. You see a similarity, not that they were uh, inferior uh, examples of what Jesus was, but that they were of their own accord monumental figures in the story of God's work amongst a certain group of people, and Jesus fits very much in that context.
Yet Jesus is working in the spirit of Moses and Elijah.
Yeah,
I like that language, and two, I mean, to look at Jesus is coming alongside of them and working with them, and I don't want to spend too much. I mean, I don't want to spend too much of our time tonight talking about how not to interpret this passage. I want to get to, well, what is the life-giving way to interpret it? But to see that Jesus is standing in the tradition, the justice tradition of the Hebrew prophets, and there has always been debate within Jewish wisdom on what fidelity to the Torah really looks like. And Jesus, it's much more, I think, life giving to see Jesus in Matthew as not a debate between Christians versus Judaism, but a debate happening within the wisdom of Judaism from Jewish voices in debate with one another over what true fidelity to what they value looks like. And so again, rather than seeing this as Christianity versus Judaism or Jesus versus Moses and Elijah. No, this is Jesus standing in the spirit of Moses and Elijah, giving his spin on what the spirit of Moses and Elijah really is. I cannot imagine the author of Matthew's gospel writing to Jewish Jesus followers teaching superstitionism. I can't imagine that. I can imagine him saying to faithful Jewish Jesus followers, this is what Judaism looks like in the context of Jesus.
yeah, no, and I think that's so important to stay keep in that historical context, and also just admit that in the centuries that followed, and Christianity becomes its religion of non-Jewish people, that was the unfortunate result of of the movement moving that direction post Constantine, is that it saw an anti-Semitism arise, and in every way, shape, or form, trying to undermine Judaism as a legitimate and important religious faith tradition.
Yeah, so even within the Gospels, within our sacred canon, we see an evolution of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism as Christianity becomes its own thing apart from Judaism. From Mark to Matthew to Luke, and then most fully in John, we just see this anti-Jewishness grow, and that's what I want to steer away from today. We need to be telling the Jesus story and interpreting the Jesus story in a way that first and foremost does not do harm, and specifically does not do harm in this context to our to the Jewish community, our Jewish friends.
Yep. No, it's very
Yeah.
important.
So again, you mentioned this in the beginning, Todd, that this is Mark's version, or sorry, Matthew's version, and Matthew's version is a little different than Mark's version. Mark emphasizes Elijah. He says Elijah and Moses show up to talk with Jesus. Matthew switches that. He switches it and says no, Moses and Elijah come, and it's little subtle things like that that I think show us the emphasis. And again, I don't think Matthew's burden is Jesus as lawgiver. I know that's traditionally the way it's interpreted. Jesus is now a new lawgiver, follow Jesus instead of Moses. But it's not Jesus as lawgiver that's being emphasized here. The fact that Moses and Elijah are brought together, Elijah spoke out against the apostasy of the elites within his day, and that's what John the Baptist and Jesus we see happening with the elites within Judaism of their day and their complicity with the Roman Empire and Roman injustice. But with Moses, it's much more helpful to see Jesus not as another lawgiver, but Jesus as another liberator like Moses. Jesus is another Moses, not in the sense of lawgiver, but Jesus is another Moses in the sense of liberator. That as Moses liberated the children of Israel from Egyptian slavery and Jewish folklore, now Jesus followers are suffering, especially the rural farmers and the poor in the urban areas are suffering the ill effects of Roman imperialism. The Roman Empire was beneficial to the rich and the wealthy, the elites in
That's right.
Jewish society, but to those on the margins and on the edges, it was destructive. And so once again, this is the demographic of the early Jesus followers, and now we're looking at Jesus as not instead of, but as another Moses in the sense of liberation, as being liberated from injustice and oppression.
And I think that's it's so important to say. And it's interesting that somehow along the way, that Moses' most important act as a human being would be considered to be the lawgiver, when he and that we would forget that no, the most important thing he ever did was he led an enslaved people out of bondage and into freedom. And
Yes.
you can't talk about being a lawgiver, you can't talk about establishing a society, frankly, a Hebrew people, uh, without having first done the work of liberation. And that the only the work of establishing a society happens post liberation. and and when Jesus is on the scene in the Roman Empire, you're talking about people who, yeah, technically I guess they were people of their free will, but if you weren't part of the elite, you were having to almost, I mean, using the phrase slave away in substandard work just to eke out a mere existence. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Life is not much better for the Jewish people of Jesus' day than it was in Moses' day. And you see Jesus coming in, and they don't need a lawgiver. The people do not need some new twist on Jewish law. They need somebody to set them free.
hmm I love that before you can establish law and society and teachings and all of that, there has to be liberation first. And I love that. That's the primary. That's the focus. And certainly Jesus did have teachings, and there are teachings that liberation is rooted in and based upon. But again, the emphasis is on liberation, and this is so key because if the comparison is Jesus versus Moses as lawgiver. Now we're in a theological religious debate
Mm,
over two religions, and we
mhm,
miss the point of the story. But if it's Jesus as another liberator, then what we're talking about is liberation from social injustice and economic injustice. And then we have to ask, well, what injustices are we wrestling with today? And liberation theologies and all of their various flavors and forms, that they tackle this, I think, really well. And womanism and feminism and all of those different Christian theologies, they deal with this. What is the injustice? What is the practical, concrete reality? What's the real harm that people are suffering right now? And how does the Jesus story speak into that
mm,
liberation? And we're no longer debating, is it Mount Sinai or the Sermon on the Mount? We're saying, ooh, we have injustice today too. And all of a sudden it gets really practical. What systemic injustice are we still fighting today? And does the Jesus story still have the ability, and do those teachings still have the ability to speak into our liberation work, our justice work now, today? And those are much more relevant questions than Christianity versus Judaism. And people are not, and Jewish people aren't harmed by that.
right. Right. And then it also makes a whole lot more sense of how Elijah ties into that as well. Is that's really it's two people working, Moses and Elijah working for the same objectives in their time and place. So Elijah, though, working to uh, free Israel from corrupt leadership,
Mm-hmm.
corrupt
Mm-hmm.
power, corrupt uh, uh, for lack of a better word, corporate interests that are at work in his time and place, and that, although again a different quote oppressor in it being amongst his own people, uh, but and Moses liberating from a different occupying power, both at this ultimately the same spirit of oppression that's taking place in Moses' time and in Elijah's time and in Jesus' times. And the unique thing about Jesus, of course, is you are seeing this marriage actually of the Roman elite and the Jewish elite working for the same side in their
Mm-hmm.
and taking care of each other while oppressing the majority of those not in the power structure.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, injustice is injustice, whether it's in-house or coming from outside.
Mm,
You know what I mean? Whether it's coming from a foreign power or whether it's your own elites and your own oligarchy that's setting into motion systems, shaping, forming systems, that building systems that are unjust. And Elijah is in-house. You know, he's speaking about the injustice that the elites were doing to the Jewish people within Judaism, but Moses is liberating them from the injustice from the outside.
mm, mm.
And I love that, Todd. I think that's well said. So there are some parallels here. Matthew, and this is kind of just, if you'll allow me to geek out for a minute, these are kind of trivial, but I think they're cool. Like in Exodus 24, Moses goes up on the mountain with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu. He's got three companions. Well, you go up the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus takes
Yeah,
Peter, James, and John, and so you've
yeah.
got these three companions. That Moses was for the mountain that Moses was on for 6 days, and this passage starts out with saying after 6 days, and
Mm,
and, and if these stories would have been read side by side in their lectionary in their day and age, then they would have just heard 6 days from Moses, and now they're saying 6 days in the story of, and audibly, those are, remember, this was an illiterate audience. They were
mm,
hearing the story being read to them. These would have been kind of not big thematic parallels, but things to say, same
right.
same subject, different story, same subject, different story. We're in the
That's right.
same thing. the face shining, Moses's face shone from speaking there on the mountain. And then we come down to Jesus, and his face is shining. Moses and Elijah both speak to God face to face. Jesus speaks to God here face to face. There's all kinds of neat little parallels, and I know they're trivial, but I still think they're cool.
Yeah, no, I think, and let's be honest, this is intentional. Whether you see the event itself as being intentionally structured by God and Jesus to create this moment, or whether Matthew is just doing good geek work like you did, Herb, and is saying, no, pay attention. I'm going to be dropping all these little Easter eggs in the story so that you can no pun intended, Easter eggs in Jesus. That was trying to go to the video game analogy. Anyway, the Easter egg, those Matthew drops those in there to make sure that people are picking up on that, because this is very intentionally structured to show those parallels again with Moses and Elijah.
It's a narrative masterpiece, and I get way more out of looking at whoever the author of the Gospel of Matthew was, seeing their skill in shaping this story and pulling out these parallels, rather than arguing over, did this historically happen this way? Well, I don't think it did, but it's a cool story.
It's a really cool, very cool story. And again, and the truth of the story is it's identifying again Jesus' pedigree as somebody doing work like Moses did and doing work like Elijah did. This is Matthew giving, in his mind, the best honor he could give to Jesus is to put him in line with these great men of the Hebrew tradition.
Yeah, these are endorsements. This is not replacement. This is endorsements, and it gives us a hint as to how, when we read the Jesus story, how we are to characterize Jesus's work. And that is the work of liberation.
Yeah.
I also like that Moses and Elijah, and I know I want to be very careful here, because I know there's a huge spectrum of beliefs on this within the Christian tradition. So I want to honor everybody with whatever their beliefs are and wherever they're at on their own journey and understanding, and what is life-giving to them and what is not. But there's a parallel here. The early church was still at this point trying to make sense out of Jesus's state murder, Jesus being murdered by the state violence that in executing Jesus. They were still trying to make sense out of that. And Moses and Elijah too, I think we would be amiss if we didn't at least point this out, that Moses and Elijah within the Jewish legends, they are stories for whom death didn't have the last word. Elijah is taken up; he just skips death in the legends, and then in Moses, there's this mythos around Moses. In I think it's Deuteronomy 34. They don't know where his grave is. Where's he even buried? And Jude 9, you've kind of got this stuff of this very cryptic kind of cosmology where Moses's body is even being argued about by the powers that be out there, the supernatural powers. So they're spokespeople. They're both figureheads or figures. They're both heroes for whom death didn't have the last word. And this was important because the good news, especially in the book of Acts, the good news for certain sectors of that early Jesus movement, before it became all about Jesus dying for people, the good news in the very beginning was not that Jesus died, or was the good news that Jesus had actually died for anyone. The good news in the book of Acts is that this Jesus whom Rome crucified has been brought back to life, that death is not having the last word again, that the attempt of the elites and the Romans to silence Jesus's voice ended up being just an interruption rather than a halting. Everything accomplished in the death of Jesus is overcome, it's undone, and it's reversed in this resurrection narrative. And again, I wrote about this at greater length in our e-site and on our Jesus for Everyone podcast this week at renewedheartministries.com. So I'm not going to go into a lot of it here. If you want a whole bunch of verses that show this, it's in that article. That's extracurricular if you want to do that. But and there's tons of them in the book of Acts. Again, in the book of Acts, the good news is not Jesus died, but that Jesus is alive.
Mhm.
And I'll just share one, Acts 13, because it's my favorite. We tell you the good news. What God promised our ancestors, he has fulfilled for us, their children. And notice through what agency? By raising up Jesus, not through Jesus dying, but through
Right.
that death being reversed. And again, Moses and Elijah are great story elements to throw in there to say, listen, death doesn't have the last word. And the teachings of Jesus, they lived on, and the Jesus followers after that. The crucifixion of Jesus didn't have the last word. We're sitting here tonight, 2,000 years later, talking about this story because death didn't have the last word. And so that's a cool parallel for me, especially as we're going into that Easter season coming up.
Yeah, I think it's so important that you brought that out, because I think that really speaks into the trajectory that Jesus is on. And even in 17 verse 9, where it says that don't tell anybody about this, what you just saw, until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. That Matthew is very much constructing this as part of the resurrection narrative, rather than painting it as part of Jesus' march towards death. Jesus did not come to ultimately accomplish dying for us. That was, as you well say, in an interruption on the way to living again. And we need to see that in the light of, again, so much. And we promised Herb that we would not go down this road tonight, so I'm trying to hold back, and just say that so much damage has been done when we teach that the ultimate thing that Jesus did was die for us. We That undermines what we're seeing in this passage of Jesus being a liberator, as someone who's is helping lead people out of a death system, leading people out of oppression systems, leading them into freedom and to renewed and better life. This is the mission of Jesus. Jesus is not on some sin management mission to death. He is on a liberation mission that ultimately ends in new life, not just in him, not just his new life, but the life of everyone that he came to be a liberator for.
Yeah, the focus is not on death. The focus here is on life that is stronger than death, or love that is stronger than hate, or inclusion that is stronger than exclusion. All of these, that's the emphasis here. Exclusion, injustice, hate, death, those don't have the last word. That's really the truth in this story, is that we hope for something greater than those things. And again, if some of this is a new thought to you, or if there's someone out there whose capillary is about to burst from hearing that Jesus didn't come to die for you, if that's a new thought for anyone, or if that's a thought that maybe you want to lean into a little bit further, again, we're not going to go into it very in depthly tonight, but I just want to throw this out there. The Easter season is upon us. Easter is coming. And I am quite sure that as we get into the Easter narratives within the lectionary, that, well, I mean, Todd and I both are on is very similar, if not the same page on this. It's going to be impossible for us to not address this again. The ways that Jesus' death has been explained for Christians has been deeply harmful for many people, and we're going to talk about that more over the next few weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else
So
we
I
have?
guess that's like um,
Anything else?
that's pretty much it. I mean, again, they were longing for liberation from Rome back then. Today, Rome is no more. So does Jesus, and we're not Jewish, so does, talking about that renewal movement, does the Jesus story in Matthew's version of the Jesus story, does that still offer anything to us today? Can the Jesus story speak into our? I mean, we're still fighting systems of injustice today, different maybe, but similar in other ways, the same but different. Can Jesus's teachings, do they still offer us anything in our liberation justice work today, as we're working to make the world a safer, more compassionate, more just world for everyone? Can the teachings of Jesus, are they still relevant? Do they still offer anything?
I think that is that question gets answered anytime you see somebody arise who follows in that similar trajectory, that similar pathway. That, again, you're seeing Jesus not be the first to be the liberator, not to be the first to be a prophetic voice against those in power. We saw that in Moses, we saw that in Elijah, we saw that in so many other people in just the Jewish tradition, let alone other faith traditions and other ethnic groups. And anytime you see somebody in our more recent time periods, you're seeing people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King carry on those type of traditions, and a similar mission of liberation that has gone before. I think whenever you see people taking that on intentionally, you see the results. You see something dramatically different from the world order and the way the world operates when people intentionally engage in the liberation process, like Jesus did and those before him did.
Yeah, and I appreciate you saying the other ethnicities and in other religions and in other movements. I also want to shout out to other genders and other sexes as well. I mean, Christian womanist theologians have done a tremendous work in showing how Jesus still relates to the work of liberation, and Christian feminists have done the same thing, and queer theologians have done the same thing. Whatever the injustice is, however injustice impacts our life, however it intersects in our daily lives, there are really good theologians out there doing good work at showing not Jesus as another lawgiver, but Jesus as liberator from injustice. And what is that speaking? How is that informing how we carry out liberation today? And I agree. I think the teachings still do speak. I mean, that's why we're doing this. But yeah, I think they do speak. But that's what they speak to.
That's right.
It's not the superiority of Christianity or the
No,
supremacy of Christianity or how Christianity replaces anything. It's no, Jesus's teachings still offer a path toward liberation today.
that's right. That's right. And along with that, you see all these movements arising grassroots out from amongst the people who are the ones going through the oppression, the best theologies are coming from those who know what it means to be part of that group, and that's in line with Jesus coming out of the peasant Jewish tradition of growing up in a uh, oh, what the his father just traveling to keep up with wherever the work was to be done by the Roman Empire, itinerant workers. In that tradition, Jesus grew up in the tradition. Moses was a slave in Egypt, who became the liberator. You see that again and again and again as it arises from those who are going through the difficulties, going through the oppression. They are the ones who end up being the ambassadors for God, the liberation messengers, if you will.
Yeah, which emphasizes again, and I love that you said that says it so well. It just emphasizes again the importance of listening to the voices of those communities that our present system pushes to the margins.
Yes,
That's where there's life. That's where there's wisdom. That's where there's change. Change happens from the bottom up, from the outside in. And we need to spend more time listening to marginalized voices.
you're here.
That's it for
Well,
me this.
yeah, I think
Todd,
we're
I got.
a good
I'm sure
spot
we
for
left
this
out
week.
something.
You mean we didn't solve every issue with in one shot, I'm disappointed.
We'll try again next week.
All right. All right.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for watching, and hopefully you've been inspired by something we've said during this time to do more than just talking.
And remember, if you enjoyed watching this, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and that little ring-a-ding-ding bell button. And you can follow me at glendalecitychurch.org and toddjleonard.com.
And you can also find me at renewedheartministries.com. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.